In the quiet farmlands of rural Pennsylvania at the turn of the 20th century, a chilling secret was festering behind the whitewashed walls of an otherwise ordinary family homestead. Neighbors would later say there had always been something peculiar about the household. They kept to themselves, their windows shuttered more often than open, their smokehouse working even on days when no one recalled slaughtering hogs. But nothing prepared this community for what they would eventually discover. It began with whispers. Travelers passing through seemed to vanish without a trace. Local men went missing after late evenings spent visiting the house. And strange scents, sweet at first, then unbearably foul, were carried on the wind from their cellar. What investigators eventually unearthed was darker than any frontier ghost story, more grotesque than any whispered superstition of old Europe. Beneath floorboards and barrels tucked away in root cellars, and even in lye-boiling tubs, they found evidence that the family had been luring in their unsuspecting neighbors, murdering them in cold blood and transforming their victims into something meant to erase every trace of their existence. Soap. This was not a crime of simple greed or passion. It was calculated, ritual-like in its consistency, and horrifying in its purpose. A family that should have been the bedrock of their community had instead become its most terrifying predators, dissolving trust as efficiently as they dissolved flesh. Before we dive into this story of innocence betrayed and horrors hidden in plain sight, please do this for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, and don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss tales like this one. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I love connecting with mystery enthusiasts across every corner of the globe. At the dawn of the 20th century, Pennsylvania was a land defined by contrasts. Towering steel mills and coal fields to the east symbolized the rapid march of American progress, while the rural farmlands scattered across the state still moved to rhythms that would have seemed familiar a century earlier. Horses pulled carriages down dirt roads, church steeples rose proudly against rolling hills, and neighbors trusted one another implicitly, because survival in such places still often came down to cooperation and shared labor. It was here, amid these quiet country communities, that one family carefully hid a darkness so unimaginable that it would, once uncovered, shock the entire region and stain local memory for generations. If you had passed by their farm in 1901, you wouldn't have thought twice. The crops in the fields grew tall and orderly. The barn smelled of hay, not neglect. They attended church at least occasionally and spoke to neighbors with just enough politeness to avoid suspicion. On the surface, they were simply one more family farming the Pennsylvania soil. But behind that facade was a secret life as methodical as it was monstrous. For years they had been luring in their neighbors and even passing travelers, men who carried the promise of money, women whose absence would not immediately attract widespread notice, and ending their lives with chilling efficiency. Why? Some whispered it was for wealth, while others later claimed it was ritualistic, a twisted inheritance of old-world practices brought with them across the Atlantic. In truth, the motives were likely a toxic cocktail: financial gain, a perverse exercise of power, and a sense of invulnerability bred by the isolation of rural life. Before suspicions came to a boil, the family seemed to blend into the backdrop of everyday life. Their farm sat on the edge of a small community where reputation mattered more than records. In places like this, background checks did not exist, and gossip was often the only form of accountability. People were judged on how firmly they shook your hand, how faithfully they attended Sunday service, and how quickly they offered a tool when you needed one. By these measures, they kept themselves just above suspicion. And yet those who lived closest to the family could not help but notice peculiarities. The heavy smoke seemed to rise more often than necessary from their outbuildings. They went to unusual lengths to keep others from entering their home, always insisting they would visit neighbors elsewhere, rather than hosting visitors in their own kitchen. Meals with them had an oddly formal quality, as though the dining table was dressed up not for familial comfort, but for appearances. Stranger still was the scent. It wasn't easy to pinpoint at first. Sometimes it seemed like nothing more than the sharp tang of strong chemicals, easily explained by the use of lye to make soap for home use, something common in those days. Other times, villagers reported catching a whiff of a greasy, pungent odor drifting across the wind, one they struggled to describe but instinctively recoiled from. One particularly sharp-nosed farmhand told of a smell, like meat long past due, boiled until nothing was left but a sour, unholy stench. No one acted on these impressions at first. In rural America at the time, people were conditioned to mind their own business. Privacy was a deeply respected value, and interfering in another family's home affairs was seen as an offense bigger than silence itself. So even as rumors began to spread, most residents dismissed them as inventions born of curiosity or envy. Who would truly believe that their neighbors, the same people who nodded after Sunday services, who purchased supplies on the same credit lines, who waved when passing by on the dusty main road, were hiding atrocious crimes in their cellar? But the evidence soon began to outpace disbelief. In the months leading up to 1901, a disturbing pattern emerged. A peddler failed to return to his established route. A widow traveling to a cousin's homestead was never seen again. 2 farm boys sent to deliver supplies were reported missing within days of entering the same area. At first, their disappearances were attributed to misadventure. Bandits still prowled rural roads. Frost and illness often claimed lives unexpectedly, and some left one life behind to begin another elsewhere. But whispers began to intensify. Wasn't it strange that so many vanished near the same stretch of farmland, the one belonging to the family who seemed to keep to themselves a little too much? In a community where everyone knew the shape of their neighbor's smoke plume and the sound of their neighbor's horse, patterns rarely went unnoticed for long. People remembered men who had been last seen near that homestead. They recalled nights when an eerie glow seemed to escape from the family's cellar windows, and mornings when the air hung heavy with a smell that resisted easy explanation. The first true break in the illusion came from something deceptively small. A local child walking near the property line stumbled upon scraps of cloth buried beneath ashes behind one of the family's sheds. The fabric appeared to be part of a coat, though it had been burned beyond recognition. When the boy tugged at it, he noticed something else embedded in the soil beneath, a button, metal and distinctive, one later recognized as belonging to a missing merchant. Nothing was reported formally at that time, for children's stories were often dismissed, but the unease deepened. The family, let us call them by the name history preserved, had mastered a certain theater of rural survival. Visitors were met with hosts who seemed reserved yet cordial. Meals, though sparse, were offered with solemnity, and always there was soap. Strangely abundant, curiously scented, it was sometimes presented as a gift to neighbors who accepted it politely, though often with unspoken questions about why this family seemed to have endless supplies of it, far more than the household could need. Homemade soap in itself was not unusual, but its greasy texture, its faint odor strangely unlike the clean-scented bars others produced, became one of many tiny warning signs that most ignored until it was too late. Soap in those days was not purchased in brightly packaged boxes from a store. It was laboriously made in kitchens and backhouses, boiling lard or tallow with wood ash lye, yielding rough, coarse bars stored in cloth sacks or wooden boxes. For most, producing it was a seasonal chore, small in scale, making enough to last one family for several months. Yet here was a household churning out soap in volumes that raised eyebrows. They claimed to sell extra at the market, to trade with neighbors, but the sheer amount was difficult to explain. This detail, seemingly small at the time, would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence discovered after the fall. The neighbors had not known it then, but their polite acceptance of those bars, their willingness to shrug off the strange smell, had placed them in horrifying proximity to what investigators would later describe as one of the most grotesque operations in early American true crime, and the disappearances kept piling up. Unlike a single tragic case, these losses were unmistakable in their accumulation. Each absence on its own could be rationalized: an accident, a runaway, a tragic misstep. But together, they began to tell a story the community could no longer ignore. Women whispered of it outside the church. Farmers discussed it while hammering fence posts. And shopkeepers, tallying their ledgers, began to notice that too many names ended with unanswered debts. Too many customers had vanished, leaving behind odd gaps that pointed again and again in the same geographic direction. The truth, however, was yet to come into sharp focus. What lay beneath that house, what simmered in its cauldrons, and what records would later show in the county archives could scarcely have been imagined in those first trembling rumors. The family was not merely producing soap with lye and lard. They were making something that erased not just evidence, but identity itself, and it was the arrogance of their own confidence. The belief that their rural isolation and social respectability formed a shield that kept them going long after the first suspicions had quietly begun to stir. They believed themselves untouchable, but history has shown us time and again that even the most carefully concealed crimes find their way to light. And in 1901, this family was about to learn that terrifying truth in the harshest possible way. The rural town was small enough that every disappearance echoed like a bell tolling in the night. In a community where everyone knew everyone else, where faces were cataloged in memory and absences were noticed quickly, the missing were not abstractions. They were farmhands who had laughed in local taverns only days before, merchants who had bartered supplies with shopkeepers, travelers whose carriages had rattled over those same muddy streets. Each vanishing left a gap that could not be filled, and it was in those spaces of silence that suspicion began to take root. The first major disappearance to set tongues wagging was that of a man named Samuel Harker, a traveling cobbler who serviced half the county. He was reliable, known for his punctual visits, his heavy satchel of tools swinging whenever he crossed a village street. In late spring, Harker was last seen making his way along the road that passed close to the family's farmhouse. He had waved to one of the neighbors and promised to repair her son's boots the next day. He never came. The boy's boots remained tattered, and Harker's satchel of tools was never recovered. At first, it was explained away. Perhaps he had taken ill. Maybe he had moved on to more prosperous towns. Such explanations satisfied people for a time. But when, several weeks later, a widow named Marianne Gross disappeared after reportedly heading in the same direction with a basket of preserves, murmurs began to harden into questions. By the time two farmhands also failed to return from errands that would have brought them past that same property line, whispers were growing into sustained conversations. Yet conversation alone rarely translated to action in those days. In rural 1901 Pennsylvania, law enforcement was thin. Sometimes a sheriff would be responsible for dozens of miles of farmland. Investigations moved slowly, papers moved more slowly, and communication lines were fragile, cut off entirely by weather or circumstance. The farmers and villagers were, for the most part, on their own. And so suspicions circled endlessly, hushed in tones that grew more agitated but no less uncertain. The family still attended church occasionally, still waved politely in passing. Could anyone really claim without proof that their neighbors might be killers? But proof, in time, began to break through the soil like weeds pressing past stone. A farm dog owned by a neighbor strayed too closely to the family's yard one morning and returned licking its muzzle, the fur around its face matted with what the owner swore was blood. More disturbing still, the dog regurgitated fragments of fabric recognizable as pieces of clothing, and the color matched, by unsettling coincidence, the last outfit worn by one of the missing farmhands. The family denied everything, insisting the dog must have wandered into a slaughter pit or garbage heap. Neighbors forced themselves to nod politely, but unease deepened like cracks spreading through plaster. It was also around this time that the notorious soap began to take on its own grim reputation. At first, bars had been offered freely to neighbors, pressed into grateful hands with explanations of surplus. But as those bars were examined more closely, their texture and faintly nauseating odor became impossible to ignore. They lacked the purely animal fat composition of typical farmhouse products. They felt denser, heavier. Some swore that even the lather rose oddly, leaving residue that no one wanted to examine too closely. Local women began to quietly dispose of the gifts, placing them in refuse piles or burying them in gardens under the cover of night. Still, the family appeared oblivious, or perhaps supremely confident. Markets still saw them offer soap for trade, neatly cut squares wrapped in fabric. Sometimes buyers purchased it out of politeness, unwilling to confront the strangeness. And so the supply entered circulation, its true origins hidden in quiet horror. By midsummer, the unease had thickened into fear. Livelihoods were disrupted. Merchants hesitated to send young men on supply runs, out of fear they might vanish en route. Parents forbade their daughters from traveling alone. Even the churches, long bastions of stability, buzzed with conversations against the backdrop of sermons about trust, accountability, and the wages of sin. The most chilling moment of this summer came with the discovery of bones. Children playing near the creek that bordered the property reported finding pale shards rising from the mud after heavy rain. At first dismissed as animal remains, the area was rife with deer and livestock. Closer inspection suggested otherwise. One piece bore markings of a human jaw, and another fragment, small but unmistakable, contained the curve of a child's rib. Quietly, without official declaration, neighbors began to connect the smell of burning, the odd soap, and now the unburied pieces of flesh the earth had thrust back to the surface. It became impossible to ignore any longer. A group of farmers finally approached local authorities. Their words were carefully chosen, reluctant yet urgent. They spoke of suspicion rather than outright accusation, but the message was clear. Something unspeakable was happening on that farm, and if the law would not intervene, they themselves might be forced to act. Authorities were initially cautious. Allegations of cannibalism or human rendering were rare and grotesque, difficult to believe without tangible evidence. However, with so many names missing and rumors aligning, an inquiry was eventually launched. A deputy and a local constable visited the farmhouse under the guise of routine questioning. What they encountered only deepened the mystery. The family greeted them politely, though with visible tension. The kitchen smelled faintly acrid, though fires appeared to have been doused hours earlier. The cellar door, conspicuously bolted, was explained away as a precaution against rodents. When asked about the disappearances, the family shrugged. Travelers were always moving along routes in this unpredictable countryside. People left debts behind. People ran from their lives. Nothing unusual had happened here, they insisted. And yet, even the brief inspection stirred alarm. The deputy later reported the unnerving sensation of being watched constantly, not just by the family but by shadows in hallways that suggested more figures present than came to the door. The constable noted tubs of lye in greater quantities than any household could reasonably require. An old cauldron bore blackened stains impossible to hide, though the hosts claimed it was used for animal rendering. The visit ended without immediate arrests but left both officers unsettled. They promised to return. In the interim, neighbors resolved to keep a closer eye, forming informal watches, keeping lanterns burning at night. Fear was gnawing at the fragile threads of community trust. The turning point came when one of the family's own extended relatives, estranged but still within reach of local gossip, quietly provided testimony to a few citizens. She confessed through trembling hands that during a rare visit years earlier, she had seen something she could never forget. A body, half consumed by lye, submerged in a vat in the cellar. She had never returned, too terrified to speak, but as the disappearances mounted, she could stay silent no longer. With that whispered confession, all hesitation slipped away. Authorities widened their inquiry, and suddenly multiple threads converged. Blacksmiths recalled being asked for tools of unusual design, hooks and cleavers far larger than necessary for pigs. Merchants remembered selling startling quantities of lye and salt, and townsfolk who had once dismissed the peculiar smell now realized it had been warning them all along. The family's cozy facade was crumbling, undone not by one loud act but by the echo of dozens of small details finally aligned into a pattern. Neighbors no longer whispered their suspicions. They muttered in urgent tones, planning what might come next. They feared that at any moment more lives could be taken if no intervention occurred. One evening during a late summer market, it is said that a farmer accidentally spilt a bundle of goods near the family's stall. What fell into the dust that day chilled him to the bone. A bar of their prized soap split open upon impact, revealing, embedded within its pale surface, something unmistakable, a fragment of a human tooth lodged deep in its greasy mass. The evidence was crude, horrific, and undeniable, and though it was quietly brushed into the dirt before witnesses could multiply, he carried the memory to authorities, lending them the courage to act swiftly. From that moment forward, the fate of the family was sealed. Investigators prepared to storm the farmhouse, while neighbors, torn between terror and rage, braced themselves for truths too monstrous to comprehend. The fall was coming. It was an autumn morning in 1901 when the long-standing suspicions reached their breaking point. The sheriff of the county, with deputies at his side, gathered a small band of men to confront the homestead that had filled neighbors with secret dread for years. No one knew exactly what they would find, but every man carried in his chest the gnawing certainty that behind those shuttered windows lay the answers to countless vanishings. They could not risk waiting any longer. The party set out at dawn, their boots crunching frost on the dirt road. Villagers watched their procession from behind curtains, unwilling to show their faces but desperate to see history shift. Some knots of men lingered at crossroads, pitchforks or hunting rifles gripped in nervous hands, ready to ride if called. There was a crackling tension in the air, the world pausing on the horizon between ordinary life and unspeakable revelation. When the authorities reached the farmhouse, they found the family surprisingly calm. The matriarch stood at the door, arms folded, lips pressed thin. Her voice was polite, almost too polite, as though she had been rehearsing this confrontation. She asked what business had brought so many men to her threshold. The sheriff, seasoned and wary, replied, "The missing." Without giving her time for denial, he ordered the deputies inside. The farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and earth, but beneath it rose another note, the sharp sting of chemicals, the greasy undercurrent that neighbors had spoken of but could never fully name. It clung to the rafters, lingered in the hallways, trailed like a phantom in every room they entered. At first, the search turned up only commonplace objects: cooking pots, quilts, farming tools. But in the cellar, the nightmare revealed itself. The door was heavily bolted, resistant even to hard strikes, but once splintered open, a foul gust spilt out, making men gag and cover their mouths with handkerchiefs. Inside, lantern light trembled as it illuminated tubs arranged in grim order, vats encrusted with residue, hooks dangling from low beams, and barrels sealed with wax. When the lids were pried from those barrels, the officers reeled back. Within the yellowed fat and gray water lay what no man could mistake: fragments of flesh, softened by lye, bones pitted and dissolved, objects that once belonged to human beings floating grotesquely in the muck. Clothing, too, shredded and stained, clung like weeds in the mixture. In a corner, stacked like cruel trophies, were tokens stripped from the dead: pocket watches, buttons, a woman's hair comb twisted with corrosion. On a table nearby rested neat squares of soap, cut with precision, their pale surface flecked with impurities that in this light seemed suddenly sinister. One deputy whispered hoarsely, "God help us, it's true." The shock of that discovery reverberated across the state. Newspapers, once dismissive of local rumors, now campaigned in bold headlines about the soap killers of Pennsylvania. Reporters descended on the town, sketch pads in hand, clamoring for testimony. The homestead was cordoned off, but the horror within could not be shut away from public imagination. Investigators pieced together how the family's grisly enterprise had been carried out. Victims were often lured under the pretense of rest, food, or trade. Travelers weary from the road were invited in, sat at a table, and sometimes offered a drink or stew. Then, as trust settled over them, the trap tightened. A blow delivered from behind, a knife slipped under a rib. In some cases, poison is added quietly to meals. Death came swiftly, not ceremoniously, for efficiency was key. Once the victims were dead, their bodies were methodically stripped of clothing and valuables. Jewelry was pawned in distant towns, coins melted and recast, but the bulk of their wealth came not from stolen goods but from what the family did next. Flesh was rendered in great cauldrons of lye. Fat was boiled down, separated, and turned into bars of soap that they could trade without suspicion. Waste was buried in shallow pits or burned in open fires, though often bones and fragments surfaced after heavy rain, as if the ground itself refused to conceal such horrors. The investigators also uncovered ledgers. These were the most chilling artifacts of all. Carefully written entries detailed names, days, and methods, tallying not only possessions taken but also estimates of body weight and how much soap each could produce. It was an economy of death, horrifyingly practical in its layout. The numbers aligned with years of disappearances, suggesting dozens, possibly more than 50 victims had met their end within those walls. Neighbors, when shown these records, went pale. They recalled the peddler who never returned, the widow with her preserves, the boys delivering supplies. One by one, the community realized how many of those lost had passed through the threshold of that house. How many had been reduced to ash and soap in the cauldrons concealed by bolted cellar doors. And yet, despite all that evidence, the question remained, why? Some argued greed was reason enough. They had turned death into profit. Others sensed something deeper, more depraved. a ritual satisfaction in reducing neighbors to nameless components of trade and barter. Those soap bars, passed hand to hand, exchanged in markets, represented not just concealment but domination. The power to erase not only a body but a person's identity, to wash them away into anonymous use. The interrogations that followed hardened that impression. When questioned, the family members were evasive. The patriarch claimed necessity, insisting poverty had demanded desperate measures. The matriarch remained silent, lips pressed tight as though no force on earth could pry loose her secrets. The children, those old enough to understand, seemed divided between terror and loyalty, their eyes wide as lantern flames when asked if they had participated. The sheriff, hardened by years of rough justice, found even his voice unsteady as he recounted what they had uncovered. "This house," he told the attending press, "is not a home but a factory for death." These people smiled as they sold bars of soap made from their neighbors' bodies. They cooked them as one cooks lard. "Let no man forget what we have seen here." Word spread with speed that outpaced the railroad. The story became a legend almost instantly, amplified by shock and imagination. Towns across Pennsylvania retold it in taverns and train cars. Some embroidered the tale with fantastical details, that the family had performed occult rites, that candles too had been fashioned from the murdered. Though records confirmed soap and possibly rendered oils, the extravagance of rumor was itself a reflection of the community's inability to process what had really happened. For months afterwards, even as the family awaited judgment, villagers spoke of the smell still clinging to the soil, lingering like a curse. They said the ground would always remember the screams buried beneath it, that rain would always bring bones to the surface as a reminder. Shops stopped accepting homemade soap at all, regardless of its source, and more people sought products from trusted factories rather than homemade trade. Trust had not merely been broken but obliterated. The trial, still months away, would provide its own horrors. But in that autumn of 1901, it was enough that the mask was off, the cellar door broken wide, the truth published for all to see. A family had, in fact, turned their neighbors into soap. And with that revelation, the question hanging over the community was no longer what had happened. It was what ought to be done with the monsters who had smiled so sweetly while poisoning the fabric of their world. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend. Sometimes the past holds lessons too dark for one person alone to carry. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Farmers who had once nodded solemn greetings to the accused now pressed against wooden benches, their knuckles white as they gripped hats in nervous hands. Merchants stood shoulder to shoulder with laborers, their faces all struck by the same blend of anger and disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously from corners of the room, eager to deliver each grotesque detail to papers across the country. The trial of the Pennsylvania soap killers had become nothing less than a national spectacle. The family sat together, flanked by armed guards. Their appearances betrayed little outward emotion, though keen observers swore the matriarch's eyes never stopped shifting, scanning the crowd as though trying to measure exactly how much the community despised her. The patriarch bore a mask of defiance, his chin high, though his hands tremored when shackles rattled. The children, those deemed old enough to face questioning, appeared pale, exhausted shadows of innocence, their futures already written in suspicion. From the very beginning, the prosecution built its case on visceral evidence. The court listened as deputies recounted their search of the home, describing the cellar with voices that cracked as though they were reliving each moment. Lantern light on cauldrons, barrels filled with half-liquefied tissue, heaps of belongings stolen from neighbors, it all landed in the room like thunder. When evidence was presented physically, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Stains from clothing, brittle bone fragments, and, perhaps most damning, the ledgers cataloging victims. Items marked with initials, possessions taken, and chilling notes about renderings were passed before the jury. Every gasp from the audience punctuated the prosecution's words. Few in the room doubted guilt, but the full scale kept dawning larger the deeper investigators read. The tally of victims rivals any crime known in the region's history. One by one, names were checked off against missing person reports, and the horrors aligned perfectly with the timeline of disappearances. Eyewitness testimony followed, cementing the grotesque portrait. A neighbor swore under oath that he had been offered soap so foul he buried it rather than bring it home. A blacksmith testified about filling requests for hooks and cleavers much larger than needed for livestock, recalling the family's odd insistence that they paid an exact coin and avoided unnecessary conversation. Perhaps the most unnerving statement came from the estranged relative who had dared speak out first. She trembled visibly as she described seeing a live vat with unmistakable contents. A human form dissolving, bubbles rising from flesh as though the body itself protested its unnatural fate. The courtroom sat in frozen silence as her words fell like stones into still water. The defense predictably grasped at desperation. Attorneys argued poverty had driven the family to madness, that hunger and illness had warped their judgment. They tried to shift blame to individual members, suggesting the patriarch alone was responsible, while the others were unwitting accomplices. They emphasized the absence of direct eyewitnesses to most murders, painting a picture of circumstantial buildup rather than incontrovertible proof. Yet for each claim, the prosecution countered with documents, stolen personal effects, and forensic consistency that no coincidence could explain. Perhaps the most damning moment came when the ledgers were read aloud in their original handwriting. Jurors listened as entry after entry coldly catalogued victims, initials, possessions taken, amounts of fat rendered. The chilling arithmetic of death filled the chamber with something worse than revulsion. It filled it with recognition that these were not frenzied outbursts, but organized, calculated crimes committed systematically, as though bookkeeping for a farm's production. To the people of Pennsylvania, the betrayal carried an extra weight. Rural families trusted their neighbors with their lives. Doors were left unbolted, and communities relied on mutual aid. For a family to turn that trust into an ambush was seen not only as murder but as desecration of the very glue holding society together. In sermons, preachers thundered about wolves in sheep's clothing. In taverns, men admitted to locking their doors at night for the first time in memory. Fear reshaped ordinary life before the verdict was even given. Press coverage expanded far beyond the county. Papers in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York sent correspondents who sensationalized the case with lurid illustrations of soap bars embedded with bones. Foreign journalists, too, described it as a uniquely American Gothic. The term soap killers spread quickly, attaching to the family like a grotesque brand. Editorialists debated whether the crimes were born of desperation or an unimaginable depravity hidden beneath ordinary farm life. Psychologists of the era, still in an age when psychology was more curiosity than science, wrote speculative essays about criminal compulsion, some insisting no sane mind could orchestrate such a campaign without some hereditary malignancy. Others claimed it was proof of how isolation corroded morality, suggesting that distance from law and community could breed monstrosities. Whatever the conclusions, the fascination only spread. Ordinary Americans, reading their morning broadsheets, were horrified but unable to look away. But the community, those who had lived alongside the killers, felt something deeper than fascination. They felt gut-wrenching betrayal. Farmers stood and testified how they had offered tools, shared harvests, exchanged goods with their neighbors, never knowing those hands that weighed potatoes and inspected hay hooks were stained with blood. Women wept quietly in the courtroom, clutching kerchiefs as they remembered friends who never returned. Children grew restless on benches, confused by words yet sensing the terror radiating from adults who had built their lives on trust now shown to be a fragile illusion. The trial dragged on for weeks, yet the outcome was never in real doubt. The jury deliberated only a short time before returning its verdict, guilty on all counts. The gavel fell hard, and the pronouncement reverberated outward. The family was condemned, not only legally, but in social memory. Whatever excuses the defense had offered, poverty, desperation, madness, none could outweigh the cold ink of their ledgers or the bars of soap that whispered evidence no man could dismiss. The sentencing was delivered swiftly, death for the patriarch and matriarch, long imprisonment for those children found complicit by age, with younger siblings placed into distant custody far from the soil stained by their name. The courtroom erupted into a clamor that was equal parts relief and revulsion. Neighbors embraced, wept, and shook fists in anger, not at the verdict, but at the black abyss of betrayal they had suffered for years. Across the nation, moralists considered the meaning of this case. Was it a sign America's progress was outpacing its moral foundation? Was it lingering Old World savagery transplanted into New World soil? Every column, every editorial was laced with attempts to explain the inexplicable. Yet explanations offered no true salve. The crimes stood monumental in their grotesqueness, defying categories and comforting logic alike. Even in their verdict, people still asked, how could anyone reduce a human being to soap? The answer, while technical, offered little consolation. In the act of rendering body fat into consumable form, a process known since antiquity, the killers had weaponized knowledge of household chemistry into something industrially monstrous. The familiarity of the method only increased the horror, for it proved that what seemed safe, domestic, innocent even, could be twisted into the unthinkable. When the trial closed and the family was led away to their fates, Pennsylvania was forever changed. The town bore scars visible in empty pews where victims once sat, in ledgers never balanced because customers never returned, in the silence of houses left without heirs. The soap killings became a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next. Beware excess privacy, beware silent neighbors, beware what lingers beneath kindness too polished. Parents told children never to accept gifts from unfamiliar homes. And everywhere, the faint smell of lye carried new associations of shuddering dread. The trial marked the moment when speculation crystallized into fact, when whispers became testimony, and when the ghosts of the missing were, at last, given voices through the evidence of their erasure. Yet even as the verdict promised justice, the community's grief remained raw. For while justice could punish the guilty, it could never return those stolen, nor cleanse the memory of soap pressed into innocent hands, bearing within it the secret shame of neighbors betrayed. The sentence was handed down in the crisp air of a Pennsylvania winter. By the time the verdict had circulated through newspapers and whispers alike, the fate of the two heads of the household was already being written into collective memory as inevitable. Death, said the judge, was both punishment and necessity, for no prison could contain crimes that had cut so deeply into the trust of a community. The patriarch and matriarch were to be executed publicly, both to fulfill the weight of justice and to demonstrate to frightened citizens that such monstrous betrayal would not go unanswered. The days leading up to the execution carried an unearthly energy. Crowds gathered not simply out of morbid interest, but also out of desperate need. They needed to see, with their own eyes, that the threat had ended. They needed to confirm that flesh and breath had been drained from those who had once drained their community of hope. In taverns, in schoolhouses, in pews, talk circled endlessly, not of guilt, which was certain, but of the reckoning that was to come. On the morning of the execution, the square outside the county jail was filled with hundreds. Wagons lined the roads, families traveled miles to attend, and newspapers hired artists to sketch the scene for the front page. The condemned were led forward in chains, flanked by guards. The patriarch looked older. His arrogance burned down into hollow-eyed defiance. The matriarch's face, once tight with calculation, sagged into a mask of stone, unreadable. As they mounted the scaffold, the murmurs of the crowd fell into a silence so absolute that the creak of the wooden boards echoed. The sheriff read the charges, his voice carrying against the cold morning. One by one, the crimes unfurled like banners of horror. Murder, dismemberment, concealment, betrayal. Gasps rippled again, though everyone already knew these facts. Then the noose was placed around their necks. Spectators turned away, unable to bear the sight, while others leaned forward, needing to witness. A lever was pulled, the trapdoor swung, and two figures dropped into history, their lives extinguished in a swift crack that mirrored the brutality they had once inflicted in secret. The crowd did not cheer. They did not roar. Instead, an eerie stillness fell. What people felt that day was not triumph, but release. They went home with a heaviness that could not be shaken, with the strange knowledge that justice, even when served, does not erase grief. The weeks that followed were filled with funerals, even for those whose remains were never fully recovered. Families built memorials out of absence, inscribing names on stones that sheltered no bones beneath. On church walls, lists of the missing were carved, a reminder as much as a tribute. Children who had once run freely were kept closer now, their parents unwilling to trust even the openness of daylight. The practical results of the crime also had a significant impact. For years afterwards, villagers refused to take homemade soap from anyone. What had once been a symbol of thrift and domesticity was now cloaked in suspicion. Women mixing lye in kitchens were eyed with a wariness no smile could erase. Market sellers found fewer buyers for their goods if they bore the faintest resemblance to the killer's wares. Necessities had been transformed into symbols of horror, everyday chores made uncanny by memory. At a deeper level, the crimes redefined trust itself. Where once doors had been left unlatched, now locks appeared on homes. Where neighbors had casually shared meals, suspicion now sharpened their eyes. This was perhaps the greatest triumph of the killers, not their grim profit from flesh and fat, but the shadow they cast over human connection. They had poisoned the very bonds of rural life, those fragile yet crucial ties of trust without which a farming community could not thrive. The trial and executions became a national touchstone, debated in editorials and retold in serialized pamphlets. Ministers cited the case as evidence of sin corrupting even the most ordinary households. Social reformers pointed to it as proof that poverty and isolation bred monsters. Legislators used it to argue for better state oversight of rural counties. Yet none of these broader discussions could change what townsfolk felt in their bones: that they had been betrayed by their own, and that such betrayal had left scars unlikely to fade in a generation. Over time, the story spread beyond Pennsylvania, taking on elements of folklore. In some retellings, it was said the family had used not only fat but bones to fashion other household items: candles, utensils, even knives with handles carved from femur. Though official records never confirmed such details, their proliferation revealed something about the human need to dramatize what was already horrific. To later generations, the soap was only the beginning. The imagination filled in the rest. Parents wielded the tale as a warning to disobedient children: behave, or risk ending up like those who vanished in the soap house. Haunted though they were, the villagers pressed forward as communities always must. Fields still had to be planted, livestock still needed fodder, and winter required wood piled by doorsteps. People married, children were born, but the echo remained. Decades later, when new families moved into the region, elders repeated the tale so often it became stitched into the very identity of the landscape. Travelers noted that Pennsylvania farmers eyed them sternly if they lingered too near any homestead. "We have long memories here," they said, a simple phrase heavy with the horror of 1901. Psychologists in the following decades circled back to the case as one of America's earliest examples of organized familial murder. They puzzled over the psychology. Was it one dominant mind imposing its will on the others, or a collective surrender to evil? Was it madness? Was it greed? Or simply cruelty stripped of shame? The uncomfortable conclusion most arrived at was this: ordinary people, under certain shadows, are capable of unimaginable things. That was the lesson no one wished to embrace, but many secretly feared. As the century pushed forward, the soap killer family faded into folklore in most of America. But in local Pennsylvania memory, they lingered sharper. School children visiting county history rooms saw photographs of the farmhouse, sketches from the trial, and ledgers behind glass cases. Teachers spoke of the case not as a far-off legend, but as local memory. The whispered question was always, how could normal neighbors do such things? That question, left unanswered, was the most haunting of all. For those who lived through it, the aftermath was less philosophical and more intimate. Widows carried folded clothing from their missing husbands, stained by time, but never recovered. Mothers sat in silence over empty chairs at Sunday meal. Brothers shouldered farms alone, building fences alongside memories too heavy to name. Their grief, their anguish, became the true price of the family's crimes. Lives punctured not just by absence, but by the grotesque knowledge of what had been done. In that sense, the execution solved only part of the wound. Justice can end lives, but it cannot resurrect them. It cannot restore laughter around a table, or erase the memory of soap bars gifted with polite smiles that, in retrospect, were horrifying tokens of atrocity. When the trapdoor fell and these killers swung, all it truly secured was the knowledge that no more would vanish into their cellar. It did not cleanse the memory of those already consumed. Years later, when the site of the farmhouse was abandoned, locals refused to reclaim it. The wood rotted, the fields grew over, but no farmer would plant where such blood had seeped into the soil. Children dared one another to venture near the remains, swearing they could still smell ash, still see shadows behind cracked windows. Ghost stories carried the tale into yet another generation, proof that some crimes refused to settle into silence but instead ripple endlessly through communal life. The legacy of 1901 was not merely the numbers tallied in a ledger or the bars of soap cut neatly into squares. Its legacy was fear, suspicion, and above all, the corrosive reminder that evil can disguise itself in the ordinary, waiting behind curtains, smiling politely in church pews, or bartering small goods in markets. That was why people whispered long after the bodies were buried and justice was served. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it lives right next door. By the early decades of the 20th century, the farmstead where the murders took place had long since stood abandoned. The walls sagged inward under the weight of rain and time, and ivy climbed over splintered beams like nature's attempt to suffocate memory itself. Yet no one forgot. The community around it never reclaimed the soil, never converted its fields back into productive acres. Instead, travelers passing by would see an empty lot crawling with weeds and wonder why such fertile land had been left to rot. The locals would say little, only that it was cursed ground. Cursed ground had significant meaning in rural America. It wasn't just superstition. It was how communities put into language the weight of collective trauma. No preacher, no sheriff, no legislator could wash away the knowledge of what had been done there. The farmhouse had not been a temporary aberration. It had been the heart of their small world turned inside out. To rebuild there would mean pretending such betrayal could be scrubbed away like dirt off a boot, when in truth, it was baked into the soil itself. Children who grew up after the events knew the story as well as they knew their catechism. Parents warned them never to linger near the ruins, not only for safety, but out of respect for the dead who were never properly buried. Some children passed rumors of seeing ghosts, pale flickers of neighbors dissolved in lie, drifting from the cellar foundation when the moon was low. Others swore they caught scents in the night, sickly sweet smoke, acrid with chemicals that rose from the ground itself. Whether or not such things were real, they anchored the memory with a permanence stronger than any plaque or gravestone. As the case seeped outward into American culture, it took on new lives. Storytellers reshaped it to suit their audiences. Pulp magazines printed twisted versions, exaggerating the number of victims or describing grotesque additions like candle making or human leather. Folklore collectors added it to their compilations as America's own Gothic, set not in castles or European forests, but in the rolling farmland of Pennsylvania. The moral shifted depending on the teller. Sometimes it was a warning about greed, about secrecy, sometimes about trusting appearances. Beneath every retelling, though, lay the same tremor of unease, that everyday life concealed the possibility of something monstrous. Criminologists of the 20th century revisited the case as one of the earliest premeditated family-run murder enterprises on American soil. Unlike isolated acts of violence, this had been systemic, organized, lasting years under the noses of neighbors. It suggested not an eruption of passion, but a chilling deliberation. Reports penned by early psychologists dissected the methods and motives with language that seemed clinical, but beneath the surface, revealed awe at the sheer darkness of human capacity. They spoke of antisocial pathology long before psychopathy became common vocabulary. They noted the absence of remorse, the orderly ledger-keeping, the deceptive respectability. To early criminology, it was a textbook in the camouflage of evil. But beyond academic circles, the ordinary public digested the story differently. To farmers, it solidified the value of keeping a tighter circle of trust, no matter how hospitable traditions had once been. To preachers, it offered a sermon-ready parable. Sin starts small, but left unchecked, consumes the body and the body of the community alike. To parents, it became a kind of folk horror they passed to children in hushed warnings about strangers, about greed, about whispered temptation. As the decades rolled on, remnants of the past occasionally resurfaced in chilling ways. In the 1920s, when road crews dug near the site, they uncovered fragments of bone that once again ignited headlines. Scientists confirmed human remains, reigniting suppressed memories among older generations. By then, the story had already grown beyond simple history, but these resurfacing relics showed it was not a myth alone. The ground still held secrets, whether unearthed by accident or left intentionally behind by a family that once believed their lie baths could erase everything. Other gruesome parallels emerged in global news: the crimes of serial poisoners, cannibals and killers who rendered flesh for practical ends, Each time, American newspapers drew lines back to Pennsylvania, referencing the soap killers as the precedent. In a macabre way, that small farming family had set a standard, their atrocity used as a benchmark for depravity. Even decades later, comparisons carried the same sting. As shocking as Pennsylvania's soap family, journalists wrote when reporting grisly overseas crimes. They had not been forgotten, but the most lasting imprint was psychological. In small-town Pennsylvania life, trust had once been a binding force. Neighbors traded goods without receipts. Doctors accepted payment in eggs or grain. That atmosphere dimmed as the memory of the killings spread. Locks appeared on more doors. Outsiders were watched with sharper eyes. Hospitality, once celebrated as a rural virtue, became calibrated, cautious. Even as generations turned and the direct witnesses passed on, the cultural shift lingered. Suspicion had nested itself into the identity of the place. Those examining the story in later years noticed something else too, how silence had protected the killers for so long. Despite strange smells, excessive soap-making, and disappearances, the family operated unchecked because no one wanted to accuse neighbors outright. Fear of offense and fear of being wrong allowed atrocity to fester. It was a discomforting truth, a lesson that sometimes civility itself can become complicity. Communities learned from it too painfully, that ignoring small signs out of politeness can pave the way toward catastrophe. For storytellers, that was the very marrow of the tale. The killers thrived not just on secrecy, but on the unwillingness of decent people to admit evil might live next door. In time, this interpretation elevated the soap family story into a fable for vigilance. Folklorists who interviewed descendants of neighbors recorded lines like, "We learned you can't always trust a smile," and "It taught us to speak when something feels wrong." The crime had become a moral compass, twisted though it was. What set this case apart from many others is how the victims were not random strangers but neighbors, people woven directly into the community fabric. Unlike highway robbers or far-off villains, the family had shared church benches, market stalls, and even gossip with those they killed. That betrayal was so profound that even to later generations it hurt to speak aloud. Victims had not simply been murdered. Their trust had been butchered alongside their bodies, and in the end, it circled back to those bars of soap, that hauntingly ordinary object. To this day, historians write about how symbolic it was. The killers turned human trust into something grotesquely utilitarian, passing it back into the same hands they betrayed. Soap, meant to clean, was forever linked to unclean actions. Ordinary bars took on new weight in Pennsylvania, their harmlessness tainted by memory. As America entered the modern age, with skyscrapers rising and cars filling roads, the legend still spread. In cities far away, storytellers would dramatize it in vaudeville shows or serialized thrillers. The butchers of Pennsylvania, they'd say, or the family who sold soap made of souls. Rural children in other states heard the tale in campfire whispers, the way urban children spoke of alleyway ghosts. It became elastic, adapting to each mouth that passed it along, yet always tied to that dark truth beneath it. Even now, more than a century later, the questions linger. How could a family organize itself around horror with such discipline? Did they all believe, or were some coerced? Was it hunger that drove them at first, before greed and cruelty consumed them? Or had they harbored darkness all along? None of these questions has a true answer. That impossibility may be why the story endures. At its core, what terrified people in 1901 still terrifies us. The monsters were not strangers lurking in forests or vagrants descending on unsuspecting towns. They were neighbors, familiar, known. They smiled, traded soap, and attended church. And behind that smiles lay atrocities that dissolved human lives into things bought, sold, and used. Their trial or their execution did not contain the legacy of the Pennsylvania soap killers. It lived on, reshaping how people thought about one another, infiltrating sermons and folklore, re-emerging in psychology journals and criminologist lectures. It transformed a simple farming tragedy into an enduring reminder of how fragile communities can be when evil hides beneath the ordinary. As the 20th century pressed forward, the story of the Pennsylvania soap family continued to lurk in archives, whispered in folklore, and noted in criminology journals. Unlike many crimes locked away firmly in their own era, This tale had a way of resurfacing exactly when society needed a reminder that evil was never fully banished. It became a mirror, reflecting not just the killers themselves, but how we choose to see our neighbors, our communities, and ourselves. When the case reappeared in public consciousness during later notorious crimes, journalists were quick to draw the connection. The comparisons were not to highwaymen or lone predators, but to those who lived among ordinary people, untouched by suspicion while carrying out unthinkable acts. The echoes were unmistakable. When other criminal enterprises were uncovered, whether in the hinterlands of America or across oceans, reporters revived Pennsylvania's tale as a touchstone of pure horror. It was the reminder that some of the darkest evils are committed not with obvious violence, but in the quiet disguise of familiarity. In criminology circles, the soap killers became a case study for organized, familial criminality. What stood out most was not only the murders but the structure behind them. This was not chaos but order. This was not frenzy but bookkeeping. Scholars emphasized the significance of the ledger. Here was evidence that every victim had been reduced to numbers, possessions, and fat rendered for bars of soap. The ledger was not only proof of guilt, it was proof of ideology. It revealed a worldview where human lives were raw material, measured, organized, and written down, as though part of an agricultural field or a shipment log. To later generations of investigators, it was the chilling confirmation that monstrosity could wear the face of logic, could clothe itself in the tedium of bureaucracy. But the most probing discussions emerged in psychology. Decades later, researchers recognized traits that aligned perfectly with what would come to be defined as psychopathy: lack of remorse, shallow affect, manipulation of others' trust, and an ability to blend into normality. The Pennsylvania killers had exhibited, long before the language for it even existed, a kind of personality disorder that seemed carved directly from textbooks a century later. And perhaps that was the most chilling realization, for if they had lived in an era when psychology was better defined, would anyone have recognized them? Or would they still have slipped unnoticed behind polite conversation and faint smiles in church pews? In local culture, however, the story lived not in journals but in memory. Even half a century later, older residents could still point to where the farmhouse had once stood, and younger listeners would fall silent. That patch of land was treated with wariness, used only when necessity demanded it, never built upon. Fields around it thrived with dairy cows or corn, but the soil at the heart of the killings was left barren as though nature itself recoiled. Some called it cursed earth, some called it respect for the dead, and others admitted they could not bear to walk there, much less live upon it. The sense of betrayal also never fully dissipated. Generations repeated the lesson: be mindful of neighbors, for wickedness does not always come with warning. Stories told in farmhouses at night often included phrases like, "Remember what happened here," reminding restless children that innocence could be shattered by secrecy. And the objects connected to the crime, soap above all, became tainted by association. In a way, the Pennsylvania case colored perceptions of homemade goods for years. Where once they carried warmth, they now carried unease. The local churches, too, used the event as a reference point. Ministers sermonized about wolves in sheep's clothing, drawing a straight line between religious parables and the reality of what had transpired on the farmland. For decades afterwards, newcomers noted that spiritual leaders here always seemed to preach as though some hidden battle against corruption was still fresh. In truth, they were still speaking to wounds inflicted years prior. When scholars compared Pennsylvania's case to infamous killers around the world, they often noted its unique qualities. In Europe, tales abounded of noble-born poisoners or castle-dwelling aristocrats who indulged in cruelty as decadents. In America, highway robbers fought with pistols and gangs on railroads. But here in Pennsylvania, evil had emerged not in castles or outlaw bands, but in a farmhouse that should have been indistinguishable from its neighbors. That ordinariness was what made it singular. To this day, historians underline that core detail. The killer's camouflage was not masks or weapons, but the performance of normality. They farmed, they traded, they shook hands at markets, wearing the weight of trust like a costume. They participated in the rituals of community without sincerity, but with skill enough to seem sincere. And when suspicion simmered, those around them hesitated to act, paralyzed by the possibility of falsely accusing. That hesitation allowed years of cruelty to pass unchecked. That hesitation became a theme in much of the retrospective discussion. Communities asked themselves what signs should have been heeded more directly. The abundance of soap, the pervasive smells, the disappearances, the relative's confession years before. These details were all signals, but the signals were ignored. The courts had delivered justice, but only after dozens of lives were consumed. Neighbors confessed later that guilt lingered in their hearts. Not guilt for the crimes themselves, but for silence, for politeness that enabled abomination. By mid-century, the case was taught not only as criminal history, but as a moral lesson. Law schools referenced it in discussions of community accountability. Criminologists used it as evidence that law enforcement must pierce the veil of social trust when evidence accumulates. Psychologists used it to illustrate the intersection between family loyalty and shared criminal enterprise. And yet, despite all the academic framing, what endured were the same grim rumors whispered in kitchens and barns, that some people had unknowingly washed their hands or dishes with soap tainted by neighbors who had vanished. That chilling image, though perhaps exaggerated with time, refused to fade. The fear that lingered was not irrational either. In some cases, samples of soap collected from the investigation were indeed found to contain trace remains consistent with a biological origin. Though the exact science of the early 1900s lacked precision, later tests confirmed what locals already knew in their guts. What they had touched, what they had carried home had crossed unholy boundaries. That revelation only deepened the wound, leaving survivors forever haunted by the possibility that atrocity had brushed against their daily lives even more literally than suspected. And so memory rerouted itself. To this day, in genealogical studies and county histories, the Soap family's name appears with an asterisk, a dark blemish in plain text, a reminder passed generation to generation. Even those unrelated adopted burden of caution, repeating stories lest anyone forget. Parents told children, trust but with open eyes, a legacy carved not from philosophy but from horror. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, Pennsylvania's 1901 killings had transformed from headline crime into an enduring legend bridging history and folklore. Museums occasionally displayed fragments from the case, ledgers, tools, grim photographs. Writers spun new narratives, some fictionalized, others academic. Each time, attention pulled back to the same theme, that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that the safe can cradle danger, that the everyday can betray. Even modern criminology textbooks still mark 1901, Pennsylvania, as one of America's earliest examples of what later researchers would label family-based organized serial murder. Cold as that phrase reads, it conveys the abnormal within the normal. This was not a solitary madman, but a household functioning like a grotesque business, planned, methodical, self-sustaining until exposed. The family was not only criminal, but systemic, modeling how cruelty can be industrialized quietly under the mask of domesticity. Every library shelf, every article printed decades after, echoed that fear even here, even next door. Evil needs no special invitation. It thrives on silence. In the years since 1901, stories of killers have multiplied across history books and across headlines. Yet few have ever left the same mark as the Pennsylvania Soap family. Many killers operate with isolation, loners stalking shadowed alleys, drifters preying on the vulnerable, obsessive figures unraveling inward. But the uniqueness of what unfolded on that quiet homestead was how collective it was, how familial. Not one but several participants bound by blood, united not in survival or industrious toil, but in secrecy and brutality. That is part of why the case persisted, long after barns collapsed into dust and ledgers yellowed with age. It forced people to confront the possibility that evil can be a family project, passed at the dinner table as easily as bread, indoctrinated as casually as tradition. A family, after all, represents sanctuary to most, trust, protection, love. To see a family twist that transforms a refuge into a machinery of horror cracked something deeper than the crimes themselves. It violated the very idea of what kin is meant to stand for. And it was not just family, but community. Think about it. These killers relied on their reputation, on the blind trust of neighbors who would never assume a polite nod could mask malice. They didn't wear masks, didn't hide in forests. They kept windows shuttered but lives open enough to seem ordinary. They smiled in church, traded at markets, and offered hospitality. That was their camouflage, more effective than darkness itself. To study this case today is to confront that contradiction. Our instinct is to divide the world neatly. Monsters are out there, heroes here with us. But what happens when the beast lives across the field waving to you on Sunday morning? That was the fear that trickled through Pennsylvania then, and that still lingers in the telling today. It is not a story of faceless shadows, but of betrayal dressed in humanity's most familiar form. When forensic science advanced later in the century, specialists revisited evidence collected in 1901, reanalyzing the soap, the bones, the residues. Though cynics had ridiculed the early reports in their time, modern testing confirmed what oral tradition insisted. The soap carried traces of human biological material, fact, not folklore. What horrifies us about this, even more than the violence itself, is what it implies. The people in those years may have unwittingly washed their hands, their clothes, even their children, with remnants of neighbors who had vanished. Imagine the cruel intimacy of that silent contamination. The instruments of daily cleanliness and household purity were twisted into the most grotesque betrayal imaginable. It is details like this that cause the story to endure in folklore. At one level, it is history. At another, it is an archetype. Writers of the Gothic instinctively understood centuries ago that horror thrives when the ordinary becomes uncanny. A household staple, soap, became a marker of sin, of erasure, of predation. The terror was not merely death, but transformation. The reduction of a human being into a commodity, faceless goods stacked for trade. People may forget dates and names, but that image, bars on a table, cut with precision, shaped from neighbors, will outlive memory itself. Communities in Pennsylvania used the tragedy as soil for moral lessons, reminders that vigilance must guard not only against strangers, but against silence and politeness that masks suspicion. The greatest question adults would mutter behind closed doors was simple: how could we not have known? And the answer that drifted back was always the same, because we did not want to know. We feared being wrong, and so we kept quiet until it was too late. That is the haunting echo still relevant today, in every neighborhood, in every trusting handshake. The execution of the patriarch and matriarch closed the formal record, but true closure never came. Survivors carried absence across their days like a permanent weight. Markets and households burned the memory into caution. The farmhouse rotted into ruin, never rebuilt, left instead as scar tissue on the land. And even when every witness was gone, their descendants whispered the story again, sometimes around kitchen tables, sometimes as warnings at twilight. In some families, it became a ritual as much as a memory, to tell the children what happened here, so it wouldn't surprise them as it had surprised us. That may be why we continue telling it now. Not only for the grisly details that curdle the stomach, but also for the reminder that trust, once surrendered unthinkingly, can be used as a weapon. We tell it so we remember that vigilance matters, that silence can feed monstrosity, that even ordinary objects must not be taken at face value if the circumstances surrounding them scream of shadows. As scholars trace the genealogy of American crime, they still pause here in Pennsylvania in 1901. They pause not because it was the deadliest, nor because it birthed the most infamous names, but because it revealed something more disturbing than high death counts or dramatic captures. It showed how easily monstrosity can be folded into normal routine, how a family can run an enterprise of death beside fields of corn and under Sunday sermons. It forced the world to abandon the illusion that killers will always look like villains. Sometimes they look like us. Over 100 years later, the land sits quiet. No farmhouse stands, no bars of soap rot on shelves. But the story endures in every retelling, in county records, in whispered folklore, in the haunted glances of descendants when the year 1901 is mentioned. The soil remembers. Communities remember, and for those who learn it anew, the lesson is as raw as it was to the men who first opened that cellar door and gagged at the smell of lie and flesh. Innocence can dissolve. Trust can curdle. Evil does not need a stranger's mask. Sometimes it speaks in voices we've heard since childhood. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself the questions Pennsylvanians asked in 1901. How would I have known? Would I have spoken up sooner? Would I have noticed the signs? Too much soap, too many vanishings, too many excuses offered with polite smiles? The terror of this tale is not in doubting their guilt, but in imagining our own blindness if something similar moved in shadows nearby. And that is why these stories matter. Not to glorify the killers, not to linger in gore, but to carve reminders into our habits. Never ignore the uneasy smell in the air. Never excuse the inexplicable just to avoid offense. Never confuse civility for safety. The people of Pennsylvania learned this lesson too late. But you, hearing it now, can carry it forward. If this story of betrayal and horror has shaken you, help me make sure stories like these never vanish into silence again. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of hidden crimes and forgotten mysteries. Tap the like button if this haunting history deserves to be remembered. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Do you think everything about this family has been uncovered? Or could there still be secrets buried in that cursed soil never to be told? I want to hear your thoughts, because history is not just about the past. It's about what we choose to see, what we choose to remember, and what we refuse to let slip away again.